Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault, by Ari Marmel. I'm BurningDogFace, and today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 13. Last time, Death visited the White City of Heaven, and he needed War to pull his bacon out of the fire, even if he would never admit it. We also learned that, their angelic enemy is such a skilled warrior that he managed to get the drop on Death, even though the horseman was already fully suspicious of him. That's a very skilled combatant right there. Let's see where this one goes. Chapter 13. How did you find me, anyway? Death still sounded sour about the whole thing, but he'd clearly given up on trying to convince, or order, War to depart. They were now some 4 levels above the courtyard, traveling at an almost leisurely pace. Although they had recovered ruin from the spot where War had leapt from the precipice, the younger horseman still walked, his mount's bridle in one hand, in deference to his brother. Death, in turn, had chosen not to summon despair to him, but to remain on foot until he'd returned physically to the horse's side. He knew his mount's injuries wouldn't last much longer than his own, but still he felt reluctant to stress the creature unnecessarily. Dust, once the horseman had left the angels behind, and it became clear that no further violence was in the offing, had fluttered down to Death's shoulder without waiting for a summons. Great help you were, Death had accused him. The crow seemed about as properly chastised as ever. They were still surrounded by streets full of angels, as well as the occasional Old One or other visitor to heaven, but word of them had clearly spread. While Death and War each received their fair share of hostile frowns, the latter receiving rather more than the former, nobody seemed at all interested in harassing them any further. It wasn't difficult, War explained, grimacing as his shoulder collided with an armored angel who hadn't stepped far enough aside. You did report to the Charred Council again before you left. You told them the Argent Spire was your next destination. Yes, but you weren't there. I'm quite sure I'd have seen you. You tend to stand out from the scenery. War ignored the jibe. I wasn't there, but the Council had no cause not to tell me when I asked. Death halted in the middle of the roadway, if only briefly. You went before the Council without being summoned first? You? Have things changed so much while I've been away? It was necessary, brother. Oh, of course, that sound I hear is the weeping of your pride, then. Don't push me! Death felt his own temper flare once more, then forced it down. Nothing to be gained in bickering, he thought. All right, he said aloud. So you knew I was heading for the library. Right. I thought, as you'd had a reasonable head start, that you were likely almost there, so I stepped through the realms to appear at the spire itself, rather than taking the long way around. I'd hoped that by the time anyone hostile to my presence had responded to the triggering of the wards, we'd already be inside, and with luck speaking with Azrael. I suppose there's a good reason you chose the epithet war and not tact. Again War's lip twisted, but otherwise he didn't react. When it became clear that you hadn't yet arrived, he said, determined not to be sidetracked, I decided to come looking for you. Given how near you were, it wasn't hard to detect the commotion when that angel threw you over the ledge. You pretty well know what happened after that. I remember it as though it had just happened. Ruin snorted something, to which War nodded in apparent agreement. I didn't see your attacker among Abaddon's retinue, he said in a blatant change of topic. Why did you want me to avoid mentioning him? Even if the general had tried to cover for him, I don't see that it would have made our position any worse. Death took a moment to trade glares at a passing pedestrian, one who came across as a bit too openly antagonistic for his liking. Only when the angel, cowed by the horseman's implacable stare, had scurried away, with as much dignity as scurrying could actually permit, did Death return to the companion walking beside him. That little ambush, he said, had nothing whatsoever to do with your prior antics, War. That wasn't retribution for dead angels. That was our enemy in the other matter we're dealing with. War's head snapped around quickly enough to dislodge his hood, which fell in several folds to lie back with the rest of the crimson cloak. What? How do you know? Did you recognize him from the Crowfather's vision? The Council really did tell you everything, didn't they? No, I couldn't make out any features in that vision. I was seeing a third-hand image taken from the memories of a crow who only caught a glimpse of the angel in the midst of battle. I think it's understandable that his recollections are a bit lacking in detail. How then? Death touched a finger to his chest beside the puckered wound that had still only partly closed. Affliction was his only answer. Ah, and then, I had wondered why being run through only a single time had slowed you down so. I've seen you shrug off far worse. Makes me wonder. How you'd do against Chaos Eater. Even without the shadows of the hood, War's expression was so flat, so bland, that even Death couldn't tell if this was a jest, some idle musing, or something more. I suggest, he said, that you make an effort never to find out. I can't imagine either of us being happy with the outcome. No, probably not. Well, rest assured that if I ever run you through, it won't be from the back. I feel better already, thank you so much. Another 100 paces passed without conversation. So if your attacker wasn't one of Abaddon's, War eventually asked, then why did you care if I mentioned him? I don't know who he is. I've never heard the name Semyaza, if that's even his true name. I've no idea what influence he holds or what allies he might have in the White City. Probably none of any consequence, given that he's partnered himself with a Maker and relies on her constructs for his army. But until I'm certain, I'd rather not risk saying the wrong thing to someone who might be more knowledgeable and less trustworthy than we believe. And our search, we have to trust someone here, brother. Azrael can be trusted, at least where our interests overlap. And I'm prepared to rely on anyone he trusts to an extent. Otherwise, it's mouth shut and eyes open. But what if we should... But Death had broken into a rapid, long-legged walk that swiftly carried him further ahead than War and Ruin. Mouth shut starting now, he called over his shoulder. Had War not already seen what had attracted his brother's attention, being addressed in such a manner might well have soured any chance of the pair working together. But this was something that any of the riders would understand. War absently placed a hand on Ruin's neck. Despair stood before them, and it was to his side that Death had rushed. The partially decayed creature had planted himself only a few strides from where he'd fallen, blocking a good half of the bridge in the process, and had refused to budge despite everything the irritated angels could do. He didn't seem particularly worse the wear from the assault, but then Despair's flesh gaped open, showing muscle and bone, when the beast was healthy. Not even Death, tightly as they were bound to each other, could be entirely certain of his mount's condition. Still, Despair had at least recovered sufficiently to greet his master with a sepulchral whinny, and to travel without sign of hitch or discomfort. That, for now, would do. The horsemen mounted, letting the animals proceed at a lackadaisical pace in deference to Despair's potential injuries, but drawing inexorably nearer their goal. Behind them, a throng of bewildered, resentful angels, and twin trails of hoofprints, one seared into the roadway, the other marked by fading wisps of bilious green vapor, and before them, visible on the horizon long before they'd come anywhere close, the imposing steeple of the Argent Spire. Even for angelic architecture, the place was colossal. The other great cathedral-like structures of the White City were as humble shanties by any comparison. Hundreds of levels of gradually sloping walls, etched columns, and stained glass windows in deep alcoves rose majestically from one of the city's floating islands. A handful of winding stairways linked the spire's foundation to the mainland, as well as to several smaller isles drifting nearby. Other than the spire itself, the only notable feature of the island it occupied was a copse of trees. The leaves were the brilliant reds and golds of an eternal autumn. The great boles appeared little more than a flower garden against the grand structure's walls. The surrounding airspace was surprisingly free of angels. The Argent Spire might well be renowned as one of the wonders and most vital installations of the White City, but that didn't make it popular. The majority of that warrior race, for all that their laws required meticulous records, looked down upon sages and archivists as their inferiors. Without any overt signal, ruin and despair broke into a gallop as they neared the edges of the terrain. Great leaps carried them, surely and steadily, up the curved stairs, and with startling rapidity, the library of the Argent Spire drew ever nearer. He hurled affliction across the chamber, howling his disdain. The weapon sparked and screeched off walls of raw, pitted ore before finally clattering sullenly to the floor. He'd hoped, prayed, that separating himself from the touch of that diseased blade might mitigate at least some of what he felt. It did not, and he'd known it wouldn't. It wasn't affliction that harrowed him in mind, body, and soul. It was, in part, frustrated rage at the interference of the second horseman, the loss of opportunity that would likely never come around again. In part. The rest... The angel hugged himself tight with arms and wings, as though he might physically hold himself from flying apart. Feverish. Sickened. Somehow impure, unclean, as though 1,000 slime-encrusted parasites squirmed between his muscle and bone, wrapped themselves about his organs, insinuated themselves in every thought. His memories were fire, his ambitions goads of leather and barbs. The last iota of his self-control he devoted to preventing every word from becoming a scream, every gesture from becoming a blow. He never forgot his true purpose, never swayed from his course. But oh, how he wanted to! Most of the emotional drive was gone, and all he felt now was a roiling, swelling urge to kill. No! Almost all he felt. Still, in the depths of his soul, clinging to the reins that kept his newfound mania in check, there remained his love for her. For her he would check these urges. For her he would tolerate the spiritual worms eating slowly through his core. For her he could stand firm against even the pernicious influence of the ancient horrors he would unleash upon creation, against the endless, implacable loathing of the grand abominations. For her he would shed only what blood need be shed, and no more. No more. For now. And that will do it for Chapter 13. Shorter one today. And yet, still very interesting, both in the interplay between death and war, not something we've gotten an enormous amount of in this franchise so far, and in this peek behind the scenes at exactly how troubled their enemy really is. I feel like things are going to come to a head in a big way. Well, I'm BurningDogFace, and I will see you on the next episode of Let's Read Darksiders, The Abomination Vault by Ari Marmel, when we continue this journey and see what Death and War's next move is now that they've finally joined forces. Later!